Good evening. I'm Valerie Paley, New York Historical Senior Vice President and Chief Historian and Director of the Center for Women's History. And I'm so pleased to welcome you to Curator Confidential, a live virtual program presented each Tuesday evening exclusively for members and other supporters of our organization. I trust that you are all safe and well. I have been delighted to be your host for History Hour with Harold Hulser on Thursdays at 6:30 p.m. And it is a thrill to have the opportunity now to share the work that has been going on behind the scenes at the Center for Women's History since the museum closed to the public as a result of the pandemic. Before I begin, I want to take a moment to thank all of our trustees, our Chairman's Council, and all of our members and other donors for your generosity. It is only through your support of and dedication to our programs that we can continue to make history matter. Now, before I launch into our program, Women at the Center, Women's History in the Age of Epidemic, I want to let you know that it will last approximately 45 minutes, including 15 minutes for questions and answers at the end, which you can submit via the Q&A function on your Zoom screen at any point during the presentation. We have disabled the chat function, so please make sure to use the Q&A after the presentation, and I will get to as many questions as time allows. So without further ado, I would like to launch the program by speaking a bit about the Center for Women's History and let you know that I'm going to divide, so I'm not going to be blathering on for 30 minutes nonstop. I will divide my half hour before the Q&A into 4 sections, punctuated with some softball questions to get some virtual audience participation going. There will be a poll function. Hopefully it will be intuitive. This is a big experiment and it should be fun. So I'll begin with a question. How many centers for women's history exist in the United States within the walls of a major museum? You have 15 seconds to answer. 1, 5, 10, or 15. Log in your answers. And, okay. Here's what the poll shows us. 67% of you thought 1, 5, 21% of you thought 5, 13% thought 10, and 0 thought 15. In fact, New York Historical Center for Women's History is the first such center and only such center within the walls of the major museum in the United States. And we are quite proud of the fact that that is the case. And perhaps it's a surprise to you that it only opened in 2017. There are other centers, of course, that are associated with universities, etc. But we have the great good fortune as a museum and a library to have much more latitude in the way we express our view of women's history. And it's a great thrill for me as a historian who happens to be a woman as opposed to a woman's historian to think about history so broadly. We were very fortunate early on when this idea came to be for our retrofitted 4th floor, our loose center, a way of contextualizing our Tiffany Gallery and the rest of the suite of galleries on the 4th floor to have some wonderful support from the Mellon Foundation, which enabled us to think very expansively about how we could do this center. We have support for a great fellowship program. These are pre and postdoctoral fellows that help me do my work. And support in thinking about what it is our mission is with women's history. So what is it? For me, women's history is part of all of history. How can we even begin to contemplate history writ large without including 51% of the population, which is women? And how does that work in the public realm? I mean, there might be people who think, well, I'm not a feminist, I'm not a woman, I'm not really interested in women's issues, but if you're interested in history, you should be interested in this amplified view that we have of it. History contextualized in the broadest way possible. And that's what we do at the center. And our very first exhibition, we have an installation view of this, was emblematic about how we think about women's history. This was about Dolly Madison. And here you see this wonderful immersive gallery that evoked the White House in the early Republic, Madison's White House. They were the first real occupants of it once it was finished. Although John Adams and Abigail Adams lived there, it was not quite complete. And it gives a sense of the sort of solidarity, the way that Dolly Madison, who was perhaps best known for ice cream, being the hostess with the mostest, really affected political agency and change, which is something one doesn't necessarily think about when you think about women in the early 19th century. She would have these Wednesday evening squeezes, they were called. They were entertainments in which all sorts of people in Washington would come together in her parlor and have conversations. And in many ways, this was a place where a great deal of politicking took place. So a woman like Dolly would say, "Oh, I'm not a politician," but in fact, what she did was deeply political, and it helped her husband, James Madison, be an effective president. But we also think about women in the 18th and early 19th century, long before they could vote. They did have a kind of political agency, not just elite white women like Dolly. Um, we asked the question how women made the Constitution work on the ground by using this prescriptive framework that was carved out by our founding fathers. Uh, how did they interpret this? What did it mean to them? What did it mean to be an American? How did they educate their children, particularly their sons, to be good citizens, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We also showed a different, like a sort of a very multi-layered look at class and gender and race and how these all came together in this moment in American history. So if we're familiar with the dead white man history, certainly we aim to show that the history you think you know can sometimes be deeper and more unexpected than that. And in fact, we did that in this show. And it was called, we see the next slide, Saving Washington. So Dolly Madison was well known for a bunch of things, but namely saving a very famous portrait of George Washington during the War of 1812. The White House and DC was being sacked and burned by the British, and she felt as though it was very important emblematically to preserve. She didn't want this portrait of Washington to be destroyed because symbolically that would mean so much more than just the destruction of a painting. But what she also did was save the aspirational idea that was Washington, D.C. And with this provocative title to this show, we were able to show that what we are trying to do is in fact see women's history in a broad way. So not necessarily have this nomenclature that would speak or bespeak a kind of women's history focus, but rather a more general focus. And it was, quite successful, and we absolutely loved the show. People were surprised that it came down after 3 or 4 months, but in fact, we have had so many other successful exhibitions. But in fact, what we do at the Center for Women's History is broader than just exhibitions. We do, for example, public programs. We have a view of a public program that we did with Stuart and Jane Weitzman. Here I am interviewing them. We were very lucky to have quite a phenomenal show of historic footwear that had been collected by the Weitzmans, Stuart Weitzman being the fairly famous shoe designer and entrepreneur, and how shoes tell stories about a number of things, about women and manufacturing and gendered aspects of shoes and their who wears them, why they wear them, the performative aspect of that. And we have such salons and smaller as well as large in our Dexter Hall, as this one is. So these are little public programs. We have the fellowship program, which I mentioned before. We have quite a robust blog series called Women at the Center. We work with our education team on Women in the American Story. It's a free online curriculum, as well as a college level MOOC, massive open online course that was created in partnership with Columbia University and Alice Kessler Harris, who is sort of the doyen of women's history, who is the chair of our scholarly board. And then also collections. I mean, of course, New York Historical is a great deal about collecting and collections, both museum and library collections. And early on, I was asked the question, well, wow, we didn't realize that New York Historical Society has a women's history collection. And in fact, we don't. But the ready answer to that is, if there are millions of objects and documents and things that have been gathered over 2 centuries, New York Historical being New York's oldest museum, founded 1804, somewhere in there, there has to be women's history. And maybe all of this stuff is just hiding in plain sight. And it's just, it takes the right researchers and curators to look at what we have anew with fresh eyes for the women's history story, because it is there. And along those lines, though, Billie Jean King, the great athlete and human rights activist, saw that we were doing this. She lives in the neighborhood and was so excited by our venture into women's history that she has donated her collection of ephemera, objects, documents, and tennis costumes to us. So this is a wonderful coup for us early on in our Genesis story. So in any case, our next topic has to do with the fact that so often when we think of a museum, we think of exhibitions that are in a museum. That's what defines a museum in the public imagination. And I'll speak for a moment about Women March, which is the current exhibition in the Joyce B. Cowan Gallery of Women's History, and ask you my next question. What important centennial in American history is being commemorated this year? Here's the poll. You have 15 seconds. Ha, everyone got it. Women's suffrage. Of course, the passage of the 19th Amendment, which removed sex as a barrier to the vote. So March is typically Women's History Month, although we are fond of saying that every month is Women's History Month at New York Historical Society. And last March was no exception. In fact, it was a much more celebratory March because we were expected to do a suffrage centennial exhibition. And the one that we alighted upon was Women March. The typical narrative that I think was expected of us was to do something that showed a steady progression from 1920 to 2020. And perhaps beginning a little before in 1848, which was the year of the Seneca Falls Convention, which Elizabeth Cady Stanton called, and it put the whole notion of women's suffrage on the table for the first time. Or a typical narrative also with that, so that's considered first wave feminism, and then second wave, of course, what happened later in the 1960s. We see major players often in these stories: Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Betty Friedan, Gloria Steinem. But as with most of the things we do, we wanted to take an unexpected approach. We wanted to think about the idea of collective action, of women marching, not to be confused with the Women's March, but the whole idea of unknown players coming together collectively and showing a diversity of the movement and intersectionality before there was such a term, the inextricable link of race, class, and gender when we think about women's stories and women's history. So the suffrage story is like the rest of history, messy and complex. And we wanted to show that and not shy away from it, and show a longer 200-year trajectory, disrupting that wave theory, first wave, second wave, and starting in 1820. 1848 didn't like come out of nowhere. 1820, women were going to churches. They were empowered with a kind of leadership within their sort of performative aspects of doing like moral suasion. Women as the moral arbiters of society, and a steady progression toward 1848, and then ultimately with the whole idea of women's suffrage on the table. Um, the march toward 1920 and the passage of the 19th Amendment. Um, but what we see also in this collective action is how issues extend way beyond suffrage in women marching. And these issues include in the 19th century anti-slavery activism, in the 20th century civil rights activism, conservatism, even environmentalism. Not of all of which sort of dovetailed with women's rights necessarily, but we see a kind of political action that women coming together can enact. And so the whole trope of women marching begins with, say, just signing your name to a petition to speak out against slavery and Indian removal in the early 19th century, and ultimately leads to the most unladylike thing of marching in the streets. And what a wonderful thing to be able to do in this exhibition is have visitors run the gauntlet. If you see on the left of this slide, this is actual video of women marching in New York in the 1917 to 1920. The whole new media of film enabled more people to learn about what was going on in the world when they went to the movies, and also these life-size environmental graphics, which really give visitors the feeling that they're walking among history, and in many ways to see much of themselves in the past. And this is a wonderful thing that we can do as public historians when we think about how we do history and interpret it in the public realm. There is a great interactive component I have discovered in my years as a public historian and curator, that visitors like to be engaged with the idea of touching screens and learning more and more historical content, and interactive touchscreens do help with that. And at the end of this particular gallery, we see a map which shows visitors that the end of the story wasn't with the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. In fact, in many states, women couldn't vote for a number of reasons. They were barred from voting by poll taxes, or if a woman married a foreign national, she lost her citizenship. Asian Americans could not vote either. So, I mean, we see just this range and the nuance of history, and this is a wonderful thing to be able to accomplish in this particular exhibition. We were also very fortunate, if we go to the next slide, and speaking about interactives, to work with the teen leaders in our Teen Tech Commons, which is adjacent to the Joyce B. Cowan Gallery, Women's History. And this is where teenagers, young girls, learn to code and to combine the whole idea of coding and design of technology with the historical research. It was an extraordinary experience for them. This is an image of them seeing their interactive for the first time. We decided that we would focus on some of the biographies. In fact, as I said, this is an exhibition about collective action, not about the leaders, but rather people coming together to enact change. But we had to, in some aspect of the show some of the biographies of some famous and not so famous people that were part of the movement, and the diversity of it, and the issues that were in play, and how these issues span the centuries and inspire future activists, and hopefully inspire these students too. It was just a thrill to work with them, and I think that we all learned so much from them, and they also in turn worked with our team to do just a beautiful job with this interactive. So now I get to the next section of my talk, which is what this talk was billed as, Women's History in the Age of COVID-19. And I will ask you your third question. How did the 1918-19 pandemic, the erroneously named Spanish flu, have a special impact on women? You have 15 seconds. And let's see how you did. Huh. So 58% of you said the essential roles of women in healthcare and manufacturing lended legitimacy to their place in the workforce. 15% said that the pandemic killed more women than men. And 27% said for the first time women were able to attend medical school and receive medical degrees. In fact, the answer is the essential roles of women in healthcare and manufacturing lended legitimacy to their place in the workforce. And this is just a really interesting thing for me to contemplate. As I mentioned, March began with with Women's History Month and the launch of this wonderful exhibition. March 1st, we had our Diane and Adam Emacs conference on women's history, which was called From Suffrage to Power, a day-long contemplation through many panel discussions with some extremely well-known scholars about the idea of suffrage, past, present, and future. But after lockdown, which happened quite abruptly on March 13th, as a historian, I got to thinking about how we could look to the past for some kind of reassurance and guidance as we try to contextualize that moment. So in those early weeks, I found myself returning again and again to the narrative of the 1918-19 influenza pandemic. It felled over 50 million people around the globe, including 670,000 in the United States. And it was remarkably like today's COVID-19 coronavirus because it disrupted and restricted daily life, although New York did not shut down. It also began in the spring, went underground over the summer, came back in a deadlier full force in the fall, as second and third waves in the fall of 1918, winter 19. And I was thinking, if history is to repeat itself, we'll have a reprieve soon, and maybe because we are more technologically advanced than we were over a century ago, maybe there will be a vaccine and we'll return to the old normal. But it also got me to thinking about, why did we forget about this? This is affecting our lives in this moment. How is it possible that it did not affect people's lives a century ago? And doing a little bit of research, I realized that male doctors, they were predominantly male, felt great self-doubt and humiliation at their failure to conquer the virus. But at that moment, though, women just rolled up their sleeves and they nursed the sick, both at home and in hospitals, in hour-by-hour drudgery that risked their own lives. And then a whole growing cadre of professional nurses, many of whom were in the foreign arena of war during the Great War, World War I, would look back on this time as something that was just really invigorating, exciting, and just exhilarating. And their response to the epidemic legitimized their work and empowered them with a new kind of respect. And more broadly, though, the severity of the flu, in fact, it killed more men than women, which is sort of the case now too. It caused a worker shortage that was exacerbated by the war. In unprecedented numbers, these proto-Rosie the Riveters took jobs outside the home and manufacturing, and sometimes these jobs had been the exclusive purview of men. So by the time 1920 rolls around, their important war and influenza work as nurses helped them gain a kind of power, and their job, being in the job force, to an economic power and a social independence. And at that moment, it just seemed like completely outrageous that women didn't have the right to vote. So, and we know what happened. The rest, as I say, is history. So I try to look to the reassurance of those silver linings buried not too deeply in the narrative of the past. The blog series has continued and grown, contextualizing this moment, not only COVID, but civil rights. We featured just recently the NAACP Silent March in 1917 in New York that protested lynching that was happening in the country, mostly in the South. And we also did a series on the Mrs. America program, which about Phyllis Schlafly, which has been airing. And so we're trying to look at our moment and see the women's history angle, which is often quite unexpected. And as a public historian working at New York Historical, I am fortunate to have its rich collections at our disposal, at my disposal, to help flesh out historical narratives in ways that speak viscerally to the past. We like to say that objects tell stories. So in the context of the last section of my talk, I'll give you an object lesson. Last question. Which of these was created by a woman industrial designer? Latex gloves, plastic face shield, N95 mask. 15 seconds. Okay. So 40% of you thought latex gloves, 26% thought a plastic face shield, and 38% thought an N95 mask. In fact, the answer is Sarah Little Turnbull, who was born in 1917 and died in 2015, created the N95 mask. This is just a fascinating story, which I just learned about, heard of something on the radio recently. And Sarah Little Turnbull was an industrial designer. She studied at Parsons, was born in Manhattan, grew up in Brooklyn, so yay, New York. She became an editorial assistant at House Beautiful, but she had a great sense of, she was a great trend spotter. And she went out on her own as a design consultant in 1958 in the sort of Mad Men era. She was, you know, this is a time of post-war inventiveness, and she was a textile artist. And as a consultant, she went into boardrooms, often the only woman in the boardroom, making presentations to men. Corporate executives at General Mills, 3M, Corning, Revlon, Ford, and she had some great clients. And she made innovative design recommendations using some of the materials that they had at their disposal. Such things as, this is interesting, the edible, unedible, lightweight insulation spacesuit for NASA astronauts, oven to table cookware, and the first glass cooktop. But the N95 mask is what is most interesting about her biography, at least for us right now. And it was part of one of her first assignments with 3M and in its gift wrapped and fabric division. The non-woven technology in particular that she was working with, she developed the first pre-made bows for gift wrap. And 3M senior management asked her to present on the possibilities of the molded material that actually was the material that the bows were made of. She had an instinct for innovation, and she used this non-woven technology to develop a molded bra cup. And then she took it a step further. Having spent time in hospitals caring for ailing relatives and friends, she saw firsthand how ineffective and unwieldy the face mask could be. Back then, you could just tie it, and it was just hard. As we know now, you don't want to be touching your mask so much. So she created this innovative rubber band ear strap for the mask, which replaced the tie closure. And ultimately, this dust mask became the medical grade N95 mask. So there is more to the story, but I just thought it was kind of fascinating to learn about this. I mean, of course, they're very rare, and it's just something that our healthcare professionals need desperately. And it was created by a woman. So who knew that there was a woman's history story behind the N95 mask? So come to the New York Historical Society, where our permanent installation on the 4th floor that shows some of our greatest hits in our museum collections and our objects and material culture. We theme them around the idea that objects tell stories. And indeed, they do. They are embedded with historical narrative, and I romanticize objects, and that I think that they bore witness to the past. They're freighted with something that's deeper than what the object exists, with the physicality of the object alone. And if you listen to Harold Holzer and my program on Civil War and 50 Objects, you'll learn more about that idea, that notion. So I'll leave you before the Q&A with a couple of installation shots of our permanent exhibition called Women's Voices. Here we look at, again, the idea of women who are known and not known, and show how they have a kind of a relevance, and that we could reach across time to see commonality between them. And we tag them not by, you know, what they were doing, you know, actress, writer, you know, just boring and sort of like typical tags, but rather see beyond the tags, the categories like speaking out, or scandal, or performance, and how you can see a kind of a sweep, a grand sweep of what these women stood for, and how they speak to one another and across time and place. Although we delimited our many choices by focusing mostly on women who were either born in New York City or state, or made an impact on the city and state. So this is an interactive, which has this important component that enables us to do deep dives into different modes of learning. By no means is this encyclopedic, but it does give a sense of how these women connect. Here we happen to see two fairly familiar faces, Gloria Steinem and Yoko Ono, but there are other women who are part of this mix. You know, we see also this idea that the dynamism that is embedded in history, and it just so happens that it is women's history that we are focused upon in this part of New York Historical's fourth floor. But hopefully when you come, you will see how it is very much part and parcel of the way we look at the past and amplify it through including these rich stories of women's contributions. So now, thank you for listening with me, and I hope you have some questions, which I will be fed by some of my colleagues. So, one of the questions is, was the N95 mask patented by 3M at inception, and if so, was the creator's name on the patent? This is a very good question, and I don't know, but certainly the creator that I spoke of really is credited with having developed this. I think we've not been as aware of the importance of the function of the N95 mask until March, I think. I myself have not been as au courant with that. But that's an excellent question for which I don't know the answer. Presumably not. This was 3M's patent, not hers. But she was a very savvy businesswoman, and so we shall see. One of my colleagues right now is working on a blog post about the N95 mask, and I hope that she will take this into consideration when she writes it. Another question is, how do we decide whose story is included in Women's Voices? This is hard because there are so many stories. And one of the interesting things that my late great colleague at New York Historical was an operations vice president, passed away, was a man who's like very not your typical women's history buff. And he looked at this Women's Voices thing in beta, and he saw a lot of kind of severe looking women from the past. And he said, where are the fun girls? We need the fun girls. Where's Miley Cyrus? I want to see Miley Cyrus. And I thought, okay, well, how do we do this in a way that feels right to someone like my colleague, but also heeds the important stories from the past? And I think we ultimately did that because we were able to combine the so-called fun girls with the more severe ones, but also the anonymous ones. Once again, we looked at some people collectively, people whose names we will never know, people like the servants from Ireland who came and in the 19th century and served an elite class. What were they escaping in Ireland? What did they come for? What did they do? How did this group of women help help the Reconstruction era in New York City. So we like to see some of these people whose names we will never know mixed in with the very famous people also. A question is, what is coming up at the Center for Women's History? I'm very pleased you asked that question. We always have exciting exhibitions on tap. And the one that we're working on right now is about Katharine Graham, who's the publisher of the New York Post. She did grow up in New York, although she's associated with Washington, D.C. But her big sort of coming out party as a transitional woman in the 1960s was the famous black and white ball, 1966, that was thrown for her by Truman Capote, in which a number of, the glitterati of New York City came out to the Plaza Hotel for this ball. But more importantly, we look at the women and the sort of transitional moment. What kind of women went to this ball, and how was Katharine Graham sort of this focal point? And how did what happened in the past before she was not trained to become the publisher of the Post? How did her life impact, and this ball as this kind of pivot moment impact what came after? So we're very excited about this exhibition, which will be opening in the spring sometime, 2021. And that's one thing. The other thing that we're extremely proud of is how we're working with the Billie Jean King collection to have a permanent display, a rotating display, which we can interpret any number of ways. It's not just about sports, it's about human rights, it's about LGBTQ rights, it's about a number of things. And it's not just about women's history either. And once again, we're working with our team leaders to create an interactive component for that. And this is going to be a very exciting process by which we can continually use new, like each successive cohort of team leaders to help us like sort of flesh out the Billie Jean King story. Also, what we're doing, what our education colleagues are doing with Women in the American Story is an extremely exciting thing. The curriculum, which shows at any moment in the historical narrative, there is a women's history piece. It's not just about, March Women's History Month, let's trot out, Eleanor Roosevelt or, Elizabeth Cady Stanton or, Shirley Chisholm. But in fact, to see like from the Revolutionary War period or before pre-contact to the present day, any step along the way you can find as women's stories, and our colleagues are working diligently on a quite a expansive program that amplifies the social studies scope and sequence. Why do I think that women acting collectively to catalyze change is so common and effective? I think well, certainly there's a safety in numbers, but there is something about the optics of many people coming together, and the empowering aspect of collective action, which affects change, and we see that throughout time, and we certainly are seeing it again in our own time, and I think that's a very important takeaway of the Women March exhibition. I think one thing also that I neglected to say about the exhibition is the notion of voting. The show ends with a call to action. We went to the trouble of gaining the vote for women in 1920. Go out and use it. Use your right. Register to vote, or if you're not registered, or go out and vote if you are registered. And we have, particularly for our young people, an interactive where you can just sign up and see, and register. So also very, very important. And I wanted to have a kind of a call to action at the end of the show to show how you are a part of this story. Another question. It seems that women through history who've had an impact were either activists, the wife of someone important, or inherited power. How different is women's leadership today now that women are accessing positions of power by themselves? Do we plan to study the specifics of their leadership? I think that's an excellent question. It's and a complicated one. and one that we should study and investigate. What's wonderful about doing the Center for Women's History is that there are many ways we can study this, either through an exhibition, although sometimes, I mean, I'm very wary of doing what amounts to a book on a wall. You know, you want to read a lot of text and understand a lot of nuance that you can only embed in text. Go read a book, don't go to an exhibition and stand and read it. So for something like this, which has great impact, this is the kind of thing that we would investigate in a salon, which is our public program series, or in a blog post, or even in reaching out to some of our scholarly fellows who are often at the pre-doctoral level, they're pre and postdoctoral, and see how these kinds of questions can impact their research and enable them to think more expansively about using the collections of the New York Historical Society to amplify their understanding and in turn the understanding of those who read their work. Next question here is, were there political alignments around the time of the 1918 pandemic associated with political parties? Did it factor into ensuing elections? This is also a very interesting topic, and obviously very much presentist. And in fact, I didn't really see any indication of that. What fascinated me, however, was Al Smith, who in fact did run for president himself, but he was elected governor in 1919 of New York State. People came out in giant, like, trainloads of people to Albany at the very height of the pandemic, and I was just really surprised by that. All the imagery we see of the soldiers returning home from the war, etc. The great, gleeful, joyful crowds of people. No one's wearing masks. They're not social distancing, although New York was very good at the social distancing themselves and had a lot of public health safeguards in play during that moment. But no, I didn't really see political alignments, although I have to admit that I'm not an expert in the field. I was looking at that moment as a way of understanding the present moment in terms of women's history in particular, and that gave me some reassurance, I guess, of how women were really part of that story. And again, and I apologize for not knowing enough answers to these really good questions. Were people of color more affected by the 1918 flu as they are in the current pandemic? And once again, I do not think so. I mean, I think that there were, people were felled by the hundreds of thousands, and it didn't discriminate. I think that in New York, in particular, we're a victim, as well as we celebrate and are victimized by the density of our city. The city, people are cheek by jowl, and that's part of the excitement of being a New Yorker. And in fact, anyone who lived in tenements would have been more susceptible to the flu. Hopefully, those who I lost my train of thought. I'm really sorry, because I'm seeing all these questions popping up, and we're desperate to finish. So sadly, we've run out of time. But I want to thank you so very much for your time and your attention and your really great questions. Okay, you stumped me, and I hopefully didn't stump you with my questions. We will be posting this and all of our Curator Confidential programs online for you to watch in the future. Once more, thank you for your exceptional support of the New York Historical Society. We look forward to seeing you back here a week from tonight for the next episode of Curator Confidential. Cunningham Confidential, an inside look at New York Historical Society's Bill Cunningham collection with my colleague, Deborah Schmidt-Bach, New York Historical's Curator of Decorative Arts. So until then, thank you.